Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt.
Welcome into the DMZ, a special early edition. We are taping on Wednesday. We normally tape Thursday or Friday. But we do have the advantage of getting to talk about the first night of the convention. How you doing, Bill, first of all?
I'm doing fine. I love conventions. So this is exciting for me, even though it's not my team meeting today. I'm verklempt at how no one else seems to like conventions, including the people that cover conventions. But perhaps we can talk about that a little bit later. But I like democracy in action, political people getting together, articulating their views to the country. I'm all nerdy and hokey like that.
Well, speaking of hokey, I love that roll call thing where it's like, Matt Lewis representing Del Rey, home of Mancini's and the Dairy Godmother. It's always like, it's never like Iowa, home to John Wayne Gacy, home to, I want to see that. SNL needs to spoof that.
Maybe at the Libertarian Convention.
That would be fun. But it's always the great things, and the snow, and the mountains, and...
But it's just sad that you don't get to see that unless you're on C-SPAN. It used to be that you'd get. Now I'm going to jump the order here, but the networks would do good 3-4 hours every night for 4 days. It was treated as a national event, and it was a chance for not just for the public to look up close. Okay, what's this party really all about? It doesn't have to be a big giant infomercial. It doesn't have to be news per se, but the media could treat it as an exploration of what's really going on with this political party today, and yet they treat it as, well, if we're not going to get big ratings off of this, we're not going to get a lot of ad revenue. Who cares that we got free government public spectrum to do our business?
Right, we're going to run reality. Essentially, it's basically a Shriners convention. I mean, in the sense of like the hoopla and the hats, and I mean, like, is that really? The speeches I could see, covering more of the speeches rather than truncating it. But do you really think there's an advantage to seeing fat Midwesterners wearing American flag polo shirts talk about
so dismissive you are about flyover country, Matt Lewis? I'm shocked.
But that's in a sense an elitist thing, though. Like it is democracy in action in a sense, but the vast majority of Americans don't participate in political parties to the extent of being delegates. I mean, there is a sort of, you can mock them or you can glamorize them, but they're not. It's not the democracy of someone just going out and voting. These are party activists.
But I would like to see reporters on the floor talking to delegates, getting their on the ground take on things, asking about the party platform. There was a little bit of a mini floor fight about how the 2016 process is going to go. That's interesting. What's behind the scenes there? Why do the party elders want to change the schedule? There's lots of things you could be talking about, and the delegates. I mean, the delegates are the representatives from these individual towns across the country to carry the flag of their party. What do they have to say? But there's very little interest in delving into that. And since what you had, I watched the NBC stream online. And so I only have a rabbit ear TV these days, so I can only get so many channels. But so I actually could see what NBC was showing for their 1 hour of coverage, and so they literally did, 5 minutes on Hurricane Isaac, which struck me as completely insane. I mean, it's not like the actual devastation has occurred that you have to break away right now to undercut the political coverage. So they waste time on that. Just have Lester Holt in the rain for a few minutes. And then you just have, Ann Romney. They had a Rubio interview, Ann Romney speech, a little bit of chatter, Christie speech, a little bit of chatter, gone. And I just can't believe how many people would actually make the time to watch something such a sliver of the convention, as opposed to when all the networks are doing it, and it sends it signal to the country. This is a big deal. This is part of a civic obligation to find out what's going on. plop yourself down, bring the kids, talk about American democracy. That's the way it was when I was a kid, and I used to think that's totally lost now.
Yeah, no, it is lost. I think you're a little bit nostalgic for that era when people shared things and everybody watched the same shows, and you did have that sense of community. But in some ways, things are better. You can still watch. You can watch essentially gavel to gavel on C-SPAN. There's a lot of stuff. Like I participated in a Google Hangout with the Washington Post the other day. So there's a lot of stuff happening, not just on the cable networks, but with streaming. And so it is a different world, and certainly there is some sense of shared community that's lost in our fragmented media market, but there's also more diversity and more choice. So,
by the way, I'm tearing up now, not because you're making me sad, but because my sinuses are a little clogged. That's all.
Well, there has been a lot of debate about are the conventions worthwhile. I mean, Tom Brokaw wrote a piece in the New York Times essentially saying we need to move past the old paradigm. Molly Ball at The Atlantic wrote a piece essentially saying, hey, look, we lost a whole day of the convention. Nobody seems to care. But she did point out some good things that conventions do provide, including highlighting future rising stars or future leaders. Ed Morrissey had a good piece essentially making the case that the convention should go to the way of the dodo. So this has been a big topic of debate, I think partially spurred on by the fact that we truncated a 4-day convention to a 3-day convention, and nobody seems to really care.
Well, I think it could be shorter. I think it could be probably 2-day. If I was a political media poobah that actually had a say in these things, I'd say, look, let's have a 2-day convention. That 1 day's capped with the VP speech, 1 day's capped with the presidential speech, but give us a good 3 hours of prime time to really explore what our party is all about. You probably don't have to spread out over 4 nights because there's not that much party business that gets discussed anymore at these things. I think that would be a fair swap if the networks would oblige.
I think that might be a good compromise, and I think that might be where we're headed. Let's talk about last night. I don't know when this is going to air, but we're taping this Wednesday morning, so we saw some interesting speeches last night. Ann Romney's speech. Rick Santorum spoke. Kelly Ayotte spoke.
Do you have just focusing on the big ones, Ann Romney and Chris Christie, the ones that were in the network coverage. Do you have a flavor of what Republicans are saying, what conservatives are saying? Do they feel like Ann Romney did what she had to do to make people feel warm and fuzzy about Mitt? Did Chris Christie do what he had to do to get people focused on debt and fiscal issues? Or is there any kind of consternation that they didn't quite hit the mark that they were hoping for?
Okay. Well, I think overall people were generally pleased. I think there was a lot of expectations for Christie. I think he did fine, but he didn't wow people. Ann Romney's speech really has been widely praised and applauded. And this is where I differ with the vast majority of observers. I did not particularly care for this speech. I mean, I think she's incredibly charismatic, incredibly charming. She's attractive. She's a good speaker. And I think a lot of people who are praising her are just giving her credit for that. And maybe they haven't seen her speak before. I have, and I know that she's good, and I know that she's incredibly likable. The speech itself, I thought, was weird. I thought that she, first of all, it was incredible pander to women. Now, it's understandable why they would do that with this whole war on women thing, but the girl power thing to me seemed incredibly transparent. And if you're going to pander, you don't want it to be obvious that you're pandering. So to me, that seemed blatantly obvious. And then the part that really struck me as being kind of off-pitch was I was expecting her to do a lot of talking about humanizing Mitt Romney. Tell the story about the time that he helped launch a search for a friend's daughter who went missing. Talk about the car accident that nearly killed him in France. Talk about how she has struggled with MS and breast cancer and how he stood by her and how they went through that as a family. Now, she did briefly mention that part, but very briefly in passing. She spent a lot more time trying to sort of prove to everybody that they struggled and that they were poor too. This struck me as really weird. Like, I'm completely against attacking people because they're rich, but I also don't really have a lot of tolerance for really rich people lecturing me on how hard they had it. Look, Mitt Romney did have to struggle, and he did build a business, but he was always one phone call away from George Romney and from being from a pretty big safety net. So it struck me as very weird that to me at least, it seemed like she really went out of her way many times to sort of talk about how hard they had it. And that really, to me, seemed off message. But I am an outlier, I have to say. And it's not just conservatives I'm seeing on Twitter. Everybody, including mainstream media folks, Bob Schieffer, I think it was Bob Schieffer, said that this was the best, one of the most persuasive spouse. I think he qualified it as spouse speeches, candidate spouse speeches he's ever heard in his life. So I think I may be in a minority here.
Well, I got to say, I agree with every last thing that you said. I'm not quite sure what I have to add. And look, I actually was so surprised by I watched the speeches and I thought Ann's speech is weird and pandering and defensive. I mean, I thought the speech was basically, oh my God, we got this huge gender gap and everybody hates us because we're rich. Let's plead with the public to say we love women and we had it really hard. I thought it exposed.
She actually said there was a thing like I love women, and it was like an Oprah Winfrey thing. Like, that to me seemed really weird. And,
well, at that point, my wife said to me, "Ew, ew, 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 ew."
Yeah,
which I then put
and
on.
That's my
on
thing.
Twitter.
Look, I grant you, I am not the Ann Romney's target audience for this message. So, but neither are the other pundits. So I think I'm trying to imagine how is this going to play, not in the hall, not with MSM pundits or conservatives on Twitter, but how's this going to play to the actual target audience?
Right, and this is where pundits have a bad track record at playing mind reader. Yeah. And really getting in the heads of your average independent suburban housewife and figuring out what their reaction is going to be if they're even watching the darn thing, which is debatable.
Right.
But I also thought that the Chris Christie speech. I loathe Chris Christie. I think he is one of the most detestable politicians on the stage today. But I concede that he is an entertaining political performer, and he comes across like a straight-talking guy, so that's why I hate him so much. I think he's a big phony. But I thought his presentation was, if not like the most over-the-top version of Christie, maybe not the YouTube Chris Christie, but at least was a natural Chris Christie, whereas I thought Ann Romney felt very stiff and awkward. But the commentary seems to be Ann Romney knocked out of the park, and Chris Christie was a giant ball hog talking about himself the entire time and barely mentioning Mitt Romney, which the Romney folks are pushing back today.
There was really surprisingly little mention of Romney on the first night. I mean, considering it's his convention. I haven't seen anybody count up the number of times he was mentioned during the speeches, but and the other point is the first night was, I guess, the message was sort of meant to be.
This is the rebuild that night.
Right. But having said that, I think the problem that Christie had is a couple things. One, the expectations were so high. I thought it was, in terms of a Chris Christie speech, it was a 7. I've seen him do better. I actually like Chris Christie. I've seen him do better, and so while it was good, it wasn't as good as I think. He didn't reach his potential. There's also some conflicting messaging going on that people have pointed out on Twitter, where Ann Romney talked about love a lot, and then Chris Christie starts off and says it's not about love, it's about respect. So there seemed to be a little bit of a dichotomy between their messaging. I have to say, I know that this isn't, nobody else feels this way and nobody else is talking about this speech, but I really liked Rick Santorum's speech. I thought that it was a great speech. I thought it was the only speech that was poetic and the only speech that moved me personally. And I think it's because it wasn't perfunctory. He wasn't trying to fit a theme of the night. It was sincere. It was a message that he's lived his life preaching. And I just thought that if Rick Santorum had given that speech every day on the campaign without being diverted and led off message, he may have won the nomination.
Well, Santorum had that same problem during the primaries. Like, he just took every bit of bait that was dangled in front of him. He would have a disorganized town hall that would get packed by folks on the left trying to trip him up, and he would just respond to every last thing thrown at him and never stay on message. And so here you have Ann Romney, instead of putting out, I think, a positive case for her husband, her and her team saying, okay, we got a gender gap problem and we have an out-of-touch wealthy elitist problem. Let's try to solve that here. And I thought with Chris Christie, the fact that he spent his first 5 minutes talking about his mom also said to me, wow, they must really be worried about their gender gap. That Chris Christie's going to take time out of his truth-telling, we must stop us from being grease speech, hard truth speech, to talk about his mom for 5 minutes?
We're not just talking about his mom, but his dad. I think he said his dad was in the audience, and then he essentially said that his mom ran the show.
Right.
His dad was in the car.
Why would you do that if you weren't worried about your gender gap?
It's perfunctory. They have a theme for the night, of course. And I think this is where Kelly Ayotte, her speech has been panned probably the most of any speech. And I think it's because when I think of Kelly Ayotte, I think of foreign policy. I've seen her speak, and she can be very good. Now, she was losing her voice, and that hurt her. But I think part of the problem was that they forced her to talk about this you didn't build it thing, and that's not her wheelhouse. So I feel like she's a little bit of a victim of that message discipline that they were enforcing last night. And I think Santorum's speech I really liked because it didn't seem forced. It seemed incredibly sincere and authentic, and and it was very poetic. I don't know if it's going to be mocked. Jon Stewart, it's going to be easily mocked because of the hands repetition, but he had lines in there about, I held hands with the American dream. It was just, it's like Peggy Noonan had wrote that speech and then gone away. She showed up, wrote Rick Santorum's speech, and then left. That's kind of my interpretation of it.
Now, I know this is something that's been on your mind this week, the question of dog whistles and code words. Do you think there were dog whistles and code words throughout the night last night, or are some people overreading into things?
They're clearly overreading into things. Cheap plug here, Bill. If you and I had about a 40-minute discussion on this topic on my podcast, and you can find that on iTunes or mattklewis.com. We talked about the Chris Matthews thing, where he went on a rant on Morning Joe and essentially said you can't talk about welfare without being a racist. That's my interpretation. You had a different interpretation.
Yeah, I would just say that. But he certainly was saying that the Romney campaign and the Republican Party are playing the race card and being racially divisive in the welfare advertising and the birther joke, etc. I don't think he was saying you can't talk about welfare at all without being racist, but he certainly was making a very harsh charge.
So check out our podcast. We talked about that. And thank you for coming on the show. Last night I saw an amazing illustration of how different people hear different things. Ann Romney, during her speech, talked about how she and Mitt Romney had a real marriage. And her point, very clearly to me, in context, was that, Hollywood glamorizes marriage, but when you go through breast cancer, when you have 5 kids, when you're married for 40 years and you go through real life, you have a real marriage. And it's not always pretty. And if you can hear my son screaming right now,
I can't.
I don't know if you can or not. But somebody on Twitter somebody I saw on Twitter took that to mean that it was a dog whistle code language for attacking gays and gay marriage. And here's the message I want to send to Chris Matthews and everybody who thinks everything is a cipher. A dog whistle, code language, is meant, the point of using code language is that your base hears it and nobody else does. If your base doesn't hear it, and liberals, if you're a conservative, let me give you an example of good code language. During the 2008 race, Barack Obama talked, we've been bamboozled, we've been hoodwinked. he was using a line from Malcolm X, which no conservatives knew. And so he was able to say that.
Which is just to clarify, Malcolm X the movie.
Malcolm X the movie.
I don't think quoting Malcolm X verbatim, but from the movie.
But people in the audience who were familiar with the movie knew that he was sort of giving an homage to the movie, and sort of, they got it. But the rest of us, and most conservatives who've never seen the Spike Lee movie, Spike Lee, right?
Yeah.
Who'd never seen the movie, had no idea. So it went over our heads. And thus, it was code language. It was a dog whistle in a sense. And I'm not saying that there's anything, evil or bad about it, but he was sort of telling his audience, a certain demographic, we know something that they don't. Now, if Ann Romney says real marriage, and all of us, her base, the conservatives, think she's talking about, what I'm talking about, like a real marriage with real struggles, that's not code language. If the only people who hear a dog whistle are your ostensible enemies, you have a really bad dog whistle. The point of using coded language is that your base hears it and nobody else does. So, I don't know if I'm expressing this point well, Bill.
No, I think you're expressing it totally well.
Over hypersensitivity to this, and people are assuming that Republicans are using all these evil code words, and yet the only people who hear the dog whistle are Chris Matthews.
Well,
what's the deal?
I would make a distinction. I think you're totally right that there is a hypersensitivity. There are people probably on both sides that overanalyze things and presume much more than is actually in front of them. It's very clear to me that the Ann Romney speech was about being defensive about having a charmed, wealthy existence and trying to push back at that and say, hey, we've had bumps and scrapes like everybody else does. I didn't think there was anything anti-gay in saying the phrase real marriage. And your point is absolutely right. It's only a workable dog whistle if your base hears it, just like it's only a workable parody, David Brooks, if anybody gets your joke.
Good point.
But I do think that, and I don't want to totally rehash the Chris Matthews English unless you want to, because for all the folks in the comment thread that say I'm a big patsy and let you run roughshod over me all the time, you let me.
Why is it that all the comments are about me? I want some commentary about you in the comment section.
Well, listen to the Matt Lewis podcast, because Matt Lewis was a potted plant who let me run roughshod over him the whole time on the show.
You probably did about 60% of the talking.
So I don't need to get a double whack at you on this, but I do think there is. Because it's not just Chris Matthews, it's also Tom Edsel at the Times, it's also Jonathan Chait, it's also William Sillett at Slate saying, because you had an interesting point, and Newt Gingrich made this point too, talking about welfare, most welfare recipients are white.
Right.
That's true. That's absolutely true. So it shouldn't be a race-baiting thing to talk about welfare there, because most welfare recipients are not black. But again, I'm talking about what does your base hear, or in this case, what does a certain percentage of white working class independent swing voters hear when they hear welfare and they hear work requirements scrapped? Do they think about it as a fellow white person in their community? Do they think about it in racial terms? And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that's not even the point. It could not be racist. It could be, as you said, it could be an antipathy towards white people who are lazy and not working, or perceptions thereof. Well, and still be wrong.
There is code. I mean, there is sort of code language. I mean, even in recent years, I've heard a radio ad from Frederick, Maryland, where I'm from, that was advertising for a laundromat, and the guy advertising it was like, and unlike some laundromats, they speak plain English at this laundromat, right. Easy to understand. And it's like, okay, I get that that's cheesy and cheap and code language, but it should be possible to have a discussion about welfare, particularly if it's newsworthy, as it in this case is, and not be assume to be, just because you mentioned welfare or welfare reform or entitlement reform, that somehow there's a racial component to it. And I think it's very sad that some people, I can't figure out if Chris Matthews legitimately believes that conservatives, that it's a very paranoid thing to believe that all of us, if we bring up this issue, are racist. I can't tell if he's paranoid or if he knows better and he's just using it as a political cudgel.
Well, I think to defend Chris Matthews here, I think there's a difference between having a reasonable debate. What is the best way to help people who are impoverished become self-sufficient? And we go in as two people on different sides who have different belief systems, how that would work, but both agree that's a good goal to have, and let's try to figure out a compromise here. Or what I think the Romney campaign is doing is saying, Barack Obama is taking something of yours and giving it to somebody else. Now that's more blatant in the Medicare ads. He's raiding your Medicare and giving it to somebody else in Obamacare.
That may or may not be a true. That point may or may not be true. But even if it's not true, it's still not inherently racist.
I take the point that you could be knowledgeable and know that welfare is accessed by predominantly white people. You could know that Medicaid is predominantly accessed by white people, therefore Obamacare, the recipients are mostly going to be white too. And it can still be wrong for Romney to be treating it in us versus them terms, particularly when it's not factually accurate what he's talking about. That's actually the big bottom line to my mind. Both ads are not factually accurate. But because he uses this sort of us versus them language, without clearly defining who the us and who the them are, you open yourself up to the charge that you're race baiting, or at least put you in the position of being asked, well, who do you mean by that? What do you think is going on?
Speaking of race, and I know we got to end this thing soon, speaking of race, I really look forward to the day. I really hope we can transcend that, because that whole it's so divisive, and it was interesting if you watched the convention last night. A lot of diversity on stage. You had Brian Sandoval, who's Hispanic. You had Nikki Haley, Indian American. Ted Cruz. Mia Love, who is a black Republican running in Utah. A lot of diversity last night. And, some people could say that it's window dressing, but it's hard to say that when these are really, in many cases, prominent elected officials or former elected officials or future elected officials, but they're not just random people they picked up at a bus stop. These are Nikki Haley is a governor, Brian Sandoval is a governor, Marco Rubio, who will speak. I don't know if it's tonight or tomorrow. I think tomorrow night, Thursday night, is a prominent U.S. senator. I really hope that that in the future that this changes the perceptions about the Republican Party, and that we have more of a colorblind, political debate where it's about ideas. Are ideas right? Are policies right? As opposed to, the cheap, politics of division.
No, I totally agree that the more knowledgeable Republican political leadership recognizes being an all-white party is a loser in the future. We have to diversify. We need to elevate who we have so we can attract more. I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And I also agree it's healthy for the whole political system for there to be more diversity in both parties. Now, there's this Atlantic story that Jonathan Chait picked up on where an anonymous Republican was quoted to the Atlantic reporter Ron Brownstein saying, this campaign, the Romney campaign, is the last time anyone is going to try this, meaning try to win the presidency with essentially an all-white vote. And coming to a recognition that, we're not getting anywhere with Hispanics, we're not getting anywhere with African Americans right now. We can't be overly idealistic about this. We got to look at hard numbers and just try to drive up that white vote. and get over the finish line, that's informing whether it's race baiting or not, the welfare and the Medicare ads. I mean, do you think that's where the campaign's really at, or is it just one anonymous guy popping up who doesn't know what the inner circle of the Romney team is thinking?
Well, I think it's one anonymous person popping off, but I mean, I do think that it is vital that the Republican Party become more inclusive. I think that I mean, again, I would love to see a day when we fight about what policy is better on its merits and who has the best ideas on its merits. And I mean, I obviously think that conservatives, by and large, have the right ideas. You would, I'm sure, disagree. But when you start to impugn people's motives and say that they're racist or that they're race baiting or that that is where it gets really nasty and ugly and really it's shameful. And if people have played for political purposes have used race, there's no doubt about that. But but sort of painting with such a broad brush, I think, stifles legitimate debate, and it's destructive. So,
if I get you off your good-hearted perch for a second, just to speak in crass political terms, Obama to this point and still today generally has really, really avoided being seen as playing a racial grievance card. I mean, he almost never, I don't think he ever has accused the Republican Party of playing a race card on him. Never accused of the Tea Party. Anything that's been put to him, he always shrugs that off. Now, here's Chris Matthews putting the issue on the table, as well as some of these other pundits, and saying, here's what Romney's really doing. So how does that cut? I mean, obviously the Obama team's attitude has been, look, our guy's the healer, our guy's the uniter. We don't need to have people in the suburban swing think that we want to play a divisive game. So let's not elevate these really hot button discussions. Let's show that we can get past this through our actions. But is there a risk now that with Chris Matthews bringing it up that some of the suburban swing voters will recoil and make it harder for Romney to actually jack up that white vote if some of those white voters don't like the idea of him playing a race card? I think it seems murky which way the issue is going to cut right now based on the demographics of the country.
Yeah, I don't think that Chris Matthews and others on the left are really doing Barack Obama a favor, because it appears that Obama has just outsourced the racial stuff to his minions, and maybe that's true, maybe it's not. And you could argue that it will hurt him. I mean, Obama is going to lose the white vote by a pretty big margin, and so that's not helpful to him. And I think that if you see these ads, which I can't stand, these ads of people who voted for Obama in 2008 and now have changed their mind. A lot of them are white people. I suspect that a lot of the defectors, a lot of the people who bought into the hope and change rhetoric in 2008 and will now vote for Mitt Romney, I suspect that a disproportionate amount of the defectors will be white. I don't have any numbers on that, but I do think
the polling would suggest that.
I think so, probably. I haven't seen the polling, but anecdotally, that's my.
Just I know that Romney's not doing well with Hispanics and is almost shut out with blacks. So if the votes are coming from somewhere, you would think it's got to be whites.
Right, but here's the problem with politics, with political campaigns, is what happens in political campaigns is that the urgent replaces the important, and you start taking short-term things. So once you make a concession, so like for example. And this happens to Republicans all the time. But I think it's happening to the Democrats now. So they've sort of made a concession, which says they have accepted the fact that they're going to lose the white vote. And so the way to win is to drive turnout among the African-American community, the Hispanic community. Once you make those assumptions, your campaign strategy changes. So now the messaging what will drive African American turnout or Hispanic turnout? Well, people are generally driven by emotion, not logic. I mean, all of us. If you're speaking to a group of NRA members and you're a Republican, you tell them they're coming to get your guns. They're coming to get your guns. If you're if you're a Democrat and you're speaking to a group of senior citizens, your message isn't going to be, well, things are great, America's good. No, your message is going to be, they're coming to take away your Social Security. So, if your goal is to drive turnout among your liberal base, if you think that's how you win, you're not going to persuade people, but you need to drive turnout and increase turnout. You're going to take messages like what they're doing, like the whole thing about saying that any talk about welfare is racist. So I think that that the short-term necessities of running political campaigns requires you to ignore and write off certain voters and focus on other voters lends itself to this sort of toxic environment that we have in politics.
Well, I want to leave it on that note. I want to keep this a little short, so perhaps the good folks at Blogging can get this up quickly. Get our takes in before we're completely stale and the day 2 and day 3 of the convention have transpired. So always good to talk to you, Matt.
All right, Bill. Good talking with you.
I think we kept this DMZ style despite the incendiary nature of our topics.
That's how we roll here at the DMZ. That's why literally dozens of people tune in.
Well, have a great final days of the convention. You excited for Ryan tonight?
I wouldn't say I'm excited.
He's not the dream.
Anything. Yeah, I think he'll give a good speech, but I think I'm just jaded and cynical from Politico.
You're keeping expectations low. I like it.
I do. It's under promise, overachieve. So.
All right, Matt. I'll talk to you soon. Hopefully, we can talk when I'm in Charlotte next week.
Let's do it. Sounds good. Until next time.
Take care.